Hey, hi there. Russ here. Great coffee. Welcome back to the shop. Today, I want to talk about my crosscut sled setup. This is my most recent way of doing it, and I actually really love it. For a long time, first thing I got to do is identify when I'm talking about a crosscut sled. There's basically two types. There's the full wide one where it uses both runners on the table saw, and you have fence on the front and the back to hold the two halves together and everything. And that's the type I've swore by for years and years, and I've used it all the time. The other type is the one that you see a lot of aftermarkets using, like the Miter 5000. I think Joint Tech also makes one that I think I have that one too. But this Miter 5000 I actually got when I bought this Unisaw from an estate sale, and it came with it. And I probably never would have bought this. I could easily make something very similar to it if I wanted to, that would do everything this thing does, but that's why I'm using it. But just remember, you could use your own saw. But the big difference between these two is that one's only on one side of the blade. The thing that's critical for you to know about a single-sided sled is you want to mount it to be used on the side of the blade so that when you tip the blade, it tips away from your sled. So if you're on a contractor saw, this thing's got to be on the right-hand side. And if it's a cabinet saw like mine, then it's got to be on the left-hand side. Keep that in mind if you decide to do a single-sided type of sled. That makes all the difference in the world. And when you see this today, how I use this, you'll understand why that's important. So the other thing I want to make a distinction about here real quick is that on my table saw, and I've talked about this in many of my past videos, so if you followed my videos for very long, you already know I use a 7 1/4 inch circular saw blade in my table saw almost exclusively anymore. I almost never take it out. And at this point, I'm using the cheapest Harbor Freight circular saw blade that I can find. It's amazing. It's the cheapest blade I can find anywhere, and it works great still. The difference between the 7 1/4 blade and the 10-inch blade that makes the big difference is the thickness of the blade. They're only a 1/16 of an inch kerf, and so they're nowhere near as aggressive for grabbing the wood and really trying to tear it out and cut a full 1/8 inch kerf instead into anything. Now, you do compromise the depth of cut, because this gives me right at a 2-inch full cut when it's at 90 degrees, and I get about 5/8 of an inch thick on an angle when it's at 45. So when you start getting past about 22.5 degrees, you can't cut a 3/4 inch piece of material anymore. Most of the time I'm cutting 1/2 inch material or less anyway, so this actually works for me. You could do the same thing with a bigger blade. That's up to you. But those are the two big differences here that I use, is that for my table saw crosscut sled here, I have actually started turning to my Miter 5000 from Incra. And like I said, I could make something else instead and not use this if I wanted to, but it's still, you would build it on the principle of the one-sided sled. So that means that you can actually cut accurately, theoretically, from the left side of your blade with this kind of setup. But what I've done here is I show you how I can actually use this blade, and I can cut. Sometimes it's the cutoff piece that you want, not the piece on the left side that's on the sled. Like if you're doing segments for doing a segmented bowl, it's kind of nice that the piece you cut off, you can make that just as accurate as you can here. In fact, yesterday I was playing with it, and I thought, oh, let's make a quick, easy, small segmented piece. And so I took and I set it up, and I cut this out, the 1-inch wide pieces at 22.5 degrees. It took me less than a minute to set the thing up to do it. And I cut these out, and they're not only accurate, but first try, not a single gap anywhere in this. That gives me very good cut rate, and I can be as accurate as any machine out there, and I don't have a whole lot of money wrapped up here. So you'll find that doing something like this is actually so easy to do. You don't need to have a segmented cutting sled, like a separate sled. I do all my cross cutting on this thing no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm making boxes or anything. So, and everything is extremely accurate. Let me show you what I've got. Keep in mind what capabilities can be, and let's go over what I have. First off, the components of this. It's multi-component rather than being all one big piece. And the biggest piece of this is my miter 5000 from Incra, the Sled itself, right here. I also have a 1/16 inch shim. Why do I have a 1/16 inch shim? Because it's the same dimension as the kerf of my blade that I'm using. If you're using an 1/8 inch blade, a full 10 inch blade, you're going to want some kind of shim that's an 1/8 inch. You want something that's the exact width of that, and you'll see why you need this as we go along here. So that this allows you to be able to accurately make cuts on your table saw setup, and you'll be able to get an accurate cut based on either side of the blade. So if it's the piece on the right hand side you want to save, you can make an accurate measurement and cut it so that that piece comes out the same. You can also cut with this thing at any angle. So you need this in order to set up your fence system that I use on this, which is the incra jig. Same incra jig you heard about so many times before. I use it on my bandsaw, I use it on my drill press, I use it on my table saw, my router table, and lots of other places. I've done 5 or 6 videos about this little jig. I paid $20 for mine on eBay. They're brand new. They're only about $70 or $80. So it's a great tool in the shop. And you'll see I found another use for it here that really helps me do fine cuts. I do a lot of bandsaw, a lot of small boxes, jewelry boxes and things. And so I also make a lot of little drawers and things like that. And so doing cross cuts, fine cuts on small pieces of wood, and I mean thin pieces of wood a lot of times that are even a lot smaller than this, and you like to be safe. Well, one of the reasons I use that blade instead of the 1/8 inch blade is because it's nowhere near as aggressive to trying to grab the wood as the 1/8 inch blade can be. And so this thing, that blade there is so much better for doing cuts, especially fine cuts on small pieces. And you'll kind of see that as we go along here. So I have my micro jig as one of the components. I keep an angle cube. I get this out so that I can adjust the blade accurately, and we'll show you how this all comes together later. I have my little shim. I have my jig, and I just clamped it to my fence system, and I'll show you how to zero it out for your blade by moving your fence in. And once you lock it down, you use the incra system on here to adjust for your fence system. So the other thing I did is I added this plate here to my system. And what this plate is just a runner and a piece of 1/2 inch board that's the same height as my sled. And this gives me a stationary. I cut it off on this side so that I get zero clearance on both sides of my blade now, which is what I want. That way little pieces aren't going to fall away and lose them. And this works really well for that. And so I have my magnet that I set back here. So I gently move this up against the magnet. And now this board pretty much stays put. So I make it kind of a snug fit on the rail. So when I put this in, it always drops in, and I just throw a magnet down to keep it from moving as I'm cutting pieces, just in case. I've never had it move. I don't think it's a problem. So, but this is my setup. So when I'm cutting, I can cut pieces here. So if I have a small piece I want to cut, I can very easily, too many pieces, I can take my piece and put it on here and make my cut, and I'm nowhere near danger of cutting my fingers, even if I'm cutting a really small piece. If the piece is really small, like this, then I just grab my gripper, and that helps me once I set the piece, and I can do that. And I can hold it safely using this instead of my hand. I also have a rail right here so that I can actually clamp it down if I really wanted to. So that makes it really safe to do a cut. If I want to do a lot of cuts, if I have a whole bunch of pieces rough cut and I want to cut them to their final length, I can very easily take a piece that, as long as up to 8 inches long, and obviously I can set the fence on this side right here on my sled, it comes with, so I can put a piece in here, and that's my stop block on this side. If the piece I want to cut off, I want to measure it and cut it accurately on the right side of the blade, like if you're making little pieces like these. All of these little pieces I cut on the right side of the blade, so I have to be able to cut accurately on the right side of the blade as well as the left. And that's why I have this set up over here. And the first thing you want to do is set this up, lock it to your fence, and loosen your fence up. And then open this up all the way to 0. And put this right on 0. If you can, like that. Always goes quicker when I don't have the camera going. So then when I made my sled, I put a piece in here and I cut it off with the table saw blade so that it gives me the 0 clearance. And I cut it all the way through. Now, since then, I've never taken this blade past halfway on here, so that this end of my board is still set to this blade dimension right at the very back end, right here. And so if I bring this up, I can bring my sled up, or my fence up, and lock it down right here. And now, oh, I didn't get it right, did I? Let me try this one more time. Just barely touch it, lock it down, and now I'm set to 0 on the left side of the blade. So this scale on my jig is accurate to the left side of the blade. If when I do my cuts, it's the right side that I want to measure off and cut, like if I'm making that segmented piece, I want these pieces to be exactly 1 inch. Then what I do is I take my 1 inch shim, I loosen my fence, and I put this in here and bring it up. And lock it down, and now the shim rubs in there. So now I am set to the left, to the right side of my blade. So if I cut a piece off, I can line up to the right side of the blade. Now, I don't always use this here, but now that it's calibrated, I can just move it back out of my way and do most of the things that I normally have to do on here. So, at this point, let's say, for example, that instead of cutting things at this, I want to move over to my to some angle up to 45 degrees. The problem that you run across is right now I can use this side as my 0 clearance, and I can use this side over here as my 0 clearance as a reference when I put a piece in here. So if I want, I can just line my red mark up to my line, and I know it'll cut it on the line. But the problem you run across is that on a table saw, if I move this blade over and tip it over, then the point of contact of where it does the cut is no longer right here next to my saw. It actually, that point of cut moves out away over here, depending on my angle of my blade as to where it is on here. And so, trying to line this up to that new line when I'm cutting an angle is where it gets to be a challenge. That's why I installed my laser light. So let's set that up and calibrate it for the session here. So I just bring it in place, and I can lock it down. First thing I want to do is make sure that it's vertically up and down exactly right. So I just line it up to the edge, and everything looks good. Then I turn it over until I see the light shining on my blade and touching here still. If it's not touching here and here at the same time, then I'm kind of out of alignment on this way. So I can loosen this nut up and slide this back and forth and turn this left to right until it makes this perfect combination. Now, this is now locked down to my blade. So that means if I want to make a cut, I can see my laser line here and here. And right down here at the bottom of this board and that laser line, that is the point of cut on my blade. It's going to cut right there. So I can mark my board either on the edge or on the top and get that cut. Being at 90, this is not lined up perfectly. So I can do cuts all day long now, as long as I don't change my blade in any way. And I don't bump my light. Sometimes bumping the light does happen. So anyway, the other thing you want to do is be able to cut things at an angle. Let me show you how you set that up real quick. So if I take this off, let's lower the blade down. And let's turn it to 45. And this takes a moment to do this. It's about 30 cranks on this thing, but it's easy cranking. And once I hit the stop, I know I'm at 45 because I've got that all set up. So now I can take this same board, if I turn it around and drop it on here, I have a slot pre-cut here. I bumped my light. So now when I crank this up, now I have my blade at a 45 and I have zero clearance on both sides. So now if I want to cut a 45, I can line this up, but now I don't know where my cut is. So if I wanted to cut to this 45, I have to line it up, and that's where my laser light will come in. Now that it's set up for 90 degrees, instead of my point of cut being right here, my point of cut is right here. So if I take and open up this knob, I can slide this back and forth. And if I line it up to right there where that tooth is coming out and lock it down, then I can cut this. And as long as I line up my laser light to the bottom of my angle of my cut mark, I can now cut this very accurately on here. But the problem is, a lot of times, you marked it at this side of the bevel cut, not down at the low side. So how do I get this to line up there? Well, if you've cut a 45 on one of your pieces so you can use it, and bring that up to where it is touching right there. Now, we loosen this up and slide it over until this is now on the edge right here. Now, I have a reference line from my laser, and I can take and cut. Right on my line, and it comes out perfect. I hit that line because I have this to help me line it up now. So what is going on here is I can now do flat cuts, and I can do 45 cuts as well as 90-degree cuts accurately and with zero clearance. Table, I don't get any tear out on either piece. So if I wanted to make and use this method, I can do box making, and I can set up my box, my cut at whatever angle I want to make, whether it's 22.5 or whatever. I use this to do all that. So this is the whole thing in a nutshell. I've got it set up. I can kind of adjust it as I go along. You can see I can set this to 45. I use my line marker sometimes so that I know where I'm making my cut because I changed the angle of my blade. And this way I can always line it up and then do an accurate cut when I have my pieces pre-marked. The other thing is, let me show you real quick here, even though you probably already know this now. If I take this piece and now I got to trim this down a little bit, it's just a little too long still. Well, if I turn this on and I can bring this up and then I can bring it over and do a quick shave. And I can accurately line this up to do that shave on that light and cut that even closer if I want to. So the laser light is really handy ever since I put that on there. When I did that, I was kind of doing that to show you one of the uses of the laser light. And honestly, I didn't realize just how handy it was for doing cuts when you change that angle of that blade. Because when you change that blade, your point of contact, a point of cut on that table saw based on the height where it's going through the table here and what angle it's at as to how far away from your sled it is, and that varies. So it's easy to line up. Use a laser light from that point forward so you can always line your piece up and know you're cutting it on a line. So this is a great little setup. The other thing that you have here, well, you know what, I think maybe at this point you kind of see how it works. Let me stop, and then I'm going to set up to do couple of different cuts. And I'll show you how this works in action, and we'll do the second video. And it's already out there too, so you don't have to wait a week or anything for it. So just go get it. It's the next one right after this one chronologically. So thanks for stopping by. I hope you learned something here. Like I said, there's lots of things going on. If you like this video or you learned something, like this video, please. I could use the help. Most importantly, though, please come back because we're nowhere near done. Thanks. We'll see you again very soon. Maybe in just about 1 minute.